Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Matthew Barber-Rowell from Liverpool Hope University and the William Temple Foundation. And my paper is Curating Spaces of Hope, a social movement's approach to combating crises in the city. The context for this paper is an emerging social movement which took place between 2010 and 2020 and was focused between 2016 and the end of 2019. The contexts were emerging crises, the global financial crash in 2008 and the austerity policy that followed, the emergence of climate change within popular discourse, and the turn to net zero, the emergence of Brexit and associated social divisions, political division and institutional decline, and an increasing mental health epidemic. There was also, in response to the variety of crises and personal struggles and sense making. I experienced these in terms of social isolation, unemployment, precarious working conditions, and also instances of domestic abuse and what's characterized in the law as coercive and controlling behavior. There's also, in addition, the fact that when I brought these claims to the authorities, I was not believed. In spite of the requisite evidence to prove my case, it was the institutions decided that they wouldn't take the case forward, which led to further offences being committed against me. So institutional discrimination was one of the personal struggles as well. So with those things in mind, 2016 saw the emergence of a social movement which became known as Curating Spaces of Hope. The movement was characterized in the inquiry into the future of civil society as bringing together innovative mixes of civil society actors, from professional community practitioners through to individual community activists, to meaning make in response to experiences of pointlessness and emptiness in personal, community, and professional life. The movement itself continued for over 3 years, characterized by 1,000+ people from across different communities and across different organizations in the Northwest, gathering together on approximately 40 occasions during that period of time, and then additional gatherings as well within digital spaces hosted primarily on Twitter. Now, participants of the gatherings characterized the movement in terms of shared values of vulnerability, freedom, and connection. And in terms of the movement itself, it produced a case study in terms of the working practices of the movement, a case study for the inquiry into the future of civil society in England. It produced terms of reference for further research, it illustrated the potential for a new paradigm and methodology for curating and co-creating a social movement and organisation based on different beliefs, values, and worldviews. And this became known as Curating Spaces of Hope. So the wider literatures within which Curating Spaces of Hope was being explored as an idea were the post-secular. Within political philosophy, that is popularized by Jürgen Habermas. The post-secular, as he put it, is not the decline of either the importance of religion and the secular in the 21st century, but the coexistence of both in often unexpected, open and creative ways within an increasingly pluralistic city. Second, within sociology of religion, there is the diversifying beliefs landscape. Putnam and Campbell in America mapped the rise of the nuns, the religious nuns, those of no religious affiliation. And similarly, Linda Woodhead did the same in the UK. And Clark and Woodhead, reflecting on the shifting and belief landscape in 2018, characterized it as the biggest change in the faith and belief landscape in Britain for centuries, even millennia. Finally, there is liminality as the new norm, building on Turner's work and the rite of passage through conditions of uncertainty, disorienting non-binary conditions, which is characterized by this quote by Baker and Dinham within their international research, their AHRC-funded research into the role of faith and belief in policy within a global context. Liminality as a new norm was a key feature within that research. So from a movement of hope, characterized in the way that I've set out, to stories of hope, what emerged from the social movement was these terms of reference, embodying and responding to liminality, characterized by differences and creative potential. They can be mapped as rhizomatic and nonlinear flows and are productive of shared values and practices. By considering them within ethnographic context, we're able to get a deep and rich understanding of the extent to which these terms of reference were present, and rather than just it being illustrative of a movement, what they meant for developing the paradigm and methodology. So 3 different sites were used: a town centre church in a post-industrial town, a social enterprise cafe, and a community hub that was run by a local church in, statistically speaking, one of the most depressed communities in the country. So in terms of mapping itself, the approach that was taken was that of assemblage theory, opening up the relational and affective flows of difference between different spaces, different territories, and developing that and kind of adding a flourish to Deleuze's assemblage theory using Latour's concept of matters of concern, so that the affective flows within a relationship within the territories that were being mapped were not just those between human actors, but were between human and non-human as well, liberating assemblages from anthropocentric assumptions and locating shared concerns as the focus of mapping of gatherings and spaces. In addition, the idea of hope within this research framework was added by Masumi, who characterized hope as affect, essentially having a next step when we're not able to see the whole picture or the whole path ahead of us. So aligning hope with effect, making hope synonymous with effect, gave the potential within the mapping exercise for all effects to be expressive of hope. But to add details to this in terms of the development of a social movement, the research, the analysis for the research highlighted different modalities and characteristics that emerged from the ethnographic sites. So rather than it simply being hope as synonymous with effect, it was hope became synonymous with types of relationships, leadership and roles and responsibilities. Hope became synonymous with sources of motivation, the interface between different groups in the public space, the stories and the authentic expressions that were offered through those stories, and then the administrative and relational flows, movements, networks, and the counting of the cost of change. So hope became synonymous with all of these things, and all of these things bubbled up in a rhizomatic form so that all were in relationship with one another simultaneously. So hope was able to be mapped as expressed by a wide variety of different and creative potential. So in terms of the paradigm itself, it wasn't just this framework for mapping. It was a case of having the capacity to broker the potential and concrete expressions of power. Again, synonymous with effect within the framework, different assets, and then guided by leadership and expressed as movements. So I'll move on to the context after the delivery of this research, the context of the pandemic, and consider what was going on there. So I'll turn briefly to research commissioned by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Faith and Society and conducted and led by Professor Chris Baker, and I was on the research team for this work. And one of the key themes that came out was that when lockdown restrictions kicked in and opportunities for innovative working opened up, faith groups and local organising groups, they initially expressed their work through a rescue and emergency response, but then there was also a movement to building back better. So as part of a shift from, as part of this shift, it was defined as demarcating a more radically open space, whereby citizens are not merely co-implementers, but co-initiators as well as co-designers. So with this kind of shift in mind, I relaunched Curating Spaces of Hope in 2022 and issued a call to action to individuals and organisations across the Northwest. The names listed in the slides: Royal Society of Arts, William Temple Foundation, Liverpool Hope University, Dialogue Society, European Innovation Council, Liverpool Charity and Voluntary Services, Gramsci Society, Archdiocese of Liverpool, and the Diocese of Manchester, all featured. 450 or so individuals have taken part so far with approximately 30 gatherings that have taken place, either situated in person or virtual online gatherings. So I'll turn to the nature of leadership within these contexts and how it's developing from the first social movement through the lens of the paradigm that's produced through the doctoral research. The characteristics for leadership we're both looking for and we're seeing are incarnational, negotiated, with different roles and responsibilities. That's within the social material nuances of the spaces that we're mapping. But in addition, there are principles to guide that leadership. Again, they emerged from the ethnographic data. These are freedom, relationship, service, effect, and authenticity, and they map notionally a transition from individual sense making through to a sense of shared stories and group outcomes. So these principles are being deployed within the networks that I'll move on to discuss with you. But just to develop some leadership theory, I'll turn to the social theory of Antonio Gramsci, who frames leadership in terms of the role of intellectuals, characterized as both organic and traditional from urban and rural contexts relative to their different strata and profession. Now, Gramsci didn't have a digital context with which to work, but so that's where the leadership characteristics from Spaces of Hope and the Gramscian theory can complement one another. But the traditional broadly understood and then the organic broadly understood are as follows. So the traditional, the philosophical and political leaders, those with named and formal influence on society, use their hegemony to supply the systems of belief accepted by ordinary people. So they do not question the actions of their rulers. Organic intellectuals being every person who demonstrate in different ways their capacity for different forms of activity. And then in terms of how this relationship works or how this role works, Gramsci notes that intellectuals should stimulate the formation of homogeneous, compact social blocks with which to give birth to their own intellectuals, not uncharacteristic of what it is that we've been doing with curating spaces of hope. So beyond their own intellectuals, their own vanguard, who in turn will react upon those blocks and in order to develop them. So the characteristics of the movement are adaptive and emergent, in line with this quote from the Prison Notebooks by Gramsci, a centralism in the movement. So to speak, a continuous adaptation of the organization or organizations, as I'll move on to true movement. Rationales beyond the context each organization finds itself in. So blending of pressure from below with leadership from above, a continual insertion of elements which emerged from the depths of the masses into the solid framework of the directing apparatus, which will ensure continuity and regular accumulation of experience. So beyond the Gramscian theory, there is within social movement theory, Chester and Welsh set out these three characteristics of a networked movement. Within the movement that took place to begin with between 2016 and 19 and characterized by post-pandemic conditions, these three are helpful characteristics. So the virtual, the situated, and the textual, which are three key characteristics of the movement that is developing, of the 30 or so gatherings that have taken place post-pandemic and the 450 people that have been involved. So in terms of the final case studies for the deployment of this movement in the city being Liverpool, three different networks have emerged. Liverpool Charity and Voluntary Services, who work with a core group of 250 organisations in the city. We've gathered 4 gatherings with that network, with 77 contributors, including senior strategic leaders and city volunteers from local community groups, all who contributed to the co-creation of a hopeful vision and strategy for eradicating poverty in the city. Recommendations were made to the board of LCVS in October 2023, including shifting the narrative in the city from independent to interdependent, adopting lived values as opposed to rhetorical values. Emphasis on equality is aspirational, but it's not the reality. Between different wards in the city, Woolton and Walton, there is a 12-year discrepancy in life expectancy between Picton and Wavertree, which our neighbours, our neighbouring wards, there is a 14-year discrepancy in life expectancy. So equality is not the reality. The third recommendation is a shift in leadership culture in the sector and in the city to move on from the corruption that has blighted the city previously. 4, model the culture shift that's being called for through LCBS working practices and resource use. And 5, nurture relationships in the sector to build trust. So these recommendations are being considered at the moment. The second context was the higher education context, Liverpool Hope University, where I am currently doing my postdoctoral research as an honorary postdoctoral fellow. 3 gatherings were conducted, exploring the question, are we hope by name or hope by nature? This got to the heart of the institution's culture and working practices and made some key recommendations for action. Again, they need to empower and trust staff. They need to shift the leadership structure from top to bottom to make it more relational. And then to develop a contextual theology of hope within this ecumenical Christian institution as a basis for a theory of change for the institution as a whole. These recommendations were placed to the Mission and Values Committee in October 2023 and received by the Vice-Chancellor, then the new Vice-Chancellor, I should add. So the third group was a political group called the Dialogue Society. They are a grassroots Islamic organisation with origins in Turkey, and they now have branches across the UK. Volunteers for the Dialogue Society are actually Turkish Muslim asylum seekers. So they find themselves on the margins of the communities that they're trying to serve within their context in Liverpool. Their intervention, or the intervention that I conducted with them, comprised digital gatherings with the initial group of asylum seekers, about 15 of them, in May 2022, offering space to reflect on their transition into the UK and into the city before co-hosting a community iftar in April 2023 with community members from the city. 120 people gathered there. We were also delighted to welcome Mayor Steve Rotherham and Cardinal Michael Fitzgerald from the Catholic Church. So we explored what hope looks like for those volunteers and the prospects for their branch in the city. And the role of Curating Spaces of Hope in that context was to broker a dialogue and to share the narrative of those on the margins in the city. So in terms of the way that Curating Spaces of Hope has developed, a movement of hope in the city that seeks justice for all is the question that we're trying to answer now. Is that what we can achieve together? Thus far, we've engaged with networks on 3 sides of the 4 sides of the public square. We've engaged with educational institutions via Liverpool Hope University. We've engaged in a political movement via the Dialogue Society, and we've engaged in the faith and civic sector through Liverpool Charity and Voluntary Services. All of these contribute to our shared public life and a movement of hope in the city. And now the call is to seek justice for all. So we seek to engage with policymakers and lawmakers in order to make this happen. Thank you.